Welcome to From Washington al Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver Carone, and we have a great show for you today. Our next guest is Jonathan Sacerdoti, who is a Middle East analyst based in London. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Jonathan, so tell us about, so obviously there's a lot of talk of whether in fact Syria has crossed the red line that President Obama had given or had placed in regards to the use of chemical weapons. There's now a lot of debate of whether, that there's sufficient intelligence, there's not sufficient intelligence, of whether the Israelis want the United States to act or not, etc. Set us clear on this. What's taking place? What's happening?
Well, obviously, it's a very delicate situation there, as of course you know, and I think that's exactly what lies behind this confusion over whether or not red lines have been crossed, whether or not chemical weapons have been used, and if so, by whom. And I think the important thing to say is that each country, whether it's Israel or the U.S., will set its own red lines over what it believes is a step too far for the Syrian regime or the Syrian rebel forces to be doing. So have chemical weapons been used? Many people interpreted President Barack Obama's words some time ago as specifying that if chemical weapons were used in Syria by Bashar al-Assad's regime, then that would be the crossing of a red line. Now, there's been some evidence that has happened. Some Israeli intelligence suggests that has happened, and some other Western intelligence and analysis suggests that happened, as has some video footage that's been released from Syria. But now the White House, of course, is saying that it might require more than simply one piece of chemical weaponry to be used, that it might require, as it was said, a whole load or a whole bunch of, I think were the words, chemical weapons to be used. And Israel's red line has always been, as far as they've stated it, that it's to do with chemical weapons falling into the wrong hands, in this case Hezbollah in Lebanon. And Israel believes that if chemical weaponry gets into the hands of Hezbollah, it's a greater risk to Israel, so that is their red line.
Now, obviously, one of the big concerns in regards to the lack of clarity as to what the red line is really the credibility of the United States. I saw that former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff made a really great quote this weekend in one of the Sunday morning shows. He said, putting aside the question of exactly what we do, once we announce there's a red line, if we don't take it seriously, then we are discrediting ourselves not only in Syria, but in Iran, North Korea, and all around the world. So President Obama really doesn't have a very easy decision here, does he?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, the whole point of a red line, whoever you are and wherever you set it, is that if it gets crossed, you do what you said you'd do when it gets crossed. However, the situation and being as complex as it is with Syria, I guess you have to think of it as the red line being made up of lots of overlying pink lines. And by that I mean it's to do with levels and extent of how far certain lines are crossed. And then, of course, while red lines shouldn't be specified by any actor unless they're willing to hold to what they said they'd do if those lines were crossed, you have to assess fully the efficacy of any action you can take after they've been crossed. So, of course, the Obama regime, the U.S. Forces will be curious whether or not, even if the red line has been crossed, whether or not intervention on their part is actually what they really should do in order to better the situation in the region and also better the U.S. interests. Of course, I don't need to remind you that the U.S. has experience of supporting rebel forces in foreign countries and finding that actually, in the end, that wasn't the smartest move for them necessarily. Take, for example, the case that the U.S. wanted to stop the Russian move into Afghanistan, and of course built up the strength of its now greatest enemy in so doing. So it's a consideration that needs to be taken very carefully. And of course, there's no sense that Israel is trying to push the U.S. into any kind of action. Israel has its own red lines. The U.S. has its own red lines. But you're absolutely right that if red lines are set and then crossed, and then the action doesn't take place, one has to wonder what an Iran, which is trying to build nuclear weapons, might be learning from that lesson. Would it be thinking, well, red lines can be crossed and no action will be taken against us, and therefore those red lines aren't so red and the threats aren't so valid?
Now, there's been news that has just come out in the last hour or so that there's a Russian airliner that came under threat while flying over Syria. Apparently, a land-to-air missile was fired and its safety was threatened. How does this complicate issues? I mean, it seems that there's not enough information out there. It's a coincidence that it's a Russian plane, which obviously the Russians being one of Assad's allies. So we don't know all the information that's out there. But how does this complicate matters?
Every piece of news that we get complicates matters, firstly, in the way that you've just described. We have to ascertain fully what happened. These days, with, of course, breaking news reaching us much quicker, even down to the lowest level of news consumers, we're never quite sure exactly what's happened, who's responsible for what. And I think it's important in all analysis, whether it's at the level of a listener to your show, whether it's at the level of an analyst or whether it's at government or intelligence level, the most important thing is to get all the information. Before you have that in place, you can't really say what is happening and the importance of things. So, of course, we'll be watching this story with interest and making sure we keep up to date with the information that we might get. But to make decisions and predictions on it, I would be a foolish man, I guess.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think it's fascinating. I'm looking right now at my Twitter feed, and it's fascinating that I even see commentators here who I would say more conservative and others that are retweeting the information coming out of Russia Today, which is obviously a mouthpiece of the Russian government in regards to details of this flight as news, and that's how misinformation comes out there and takes place, which is very dangerous, particularly in a situation like that taking place in Syria. Let me ask you more broadly. I mean, obviously the red line has been chemical weapons, but, chemical weapons, it seems at this point, are going to do much more damage than the 70,000 Syrians that are already dead. I mean, are we really just at the past the point of all red lines in this conflict?
Well, I think it's interesting to consider how different states should approach the unrest in Syria. And, of course, it's tragic and difficult for anyone to watch with the tens of thousands of deaths that we hear are going on there. And so I think that the problem is that we need to perhaps reassess what the actual war taking place there is, civil war taking place. Is it simply a case of the romantic notion that perhaps we once had, that there was a tyrannical regime which was trying to be overthrown by a group of rebels committed to a more democratic system? Or is it, in fact, as has perhaps become more apparent and more obvious over the last couple of years, a war where both sides are made up of, let's say, bad guys, to use very basic terms, neither of whom may be great allies for the U.S. or for other Western forces. And so it makes it very difficult to know, even in the face of these horrific images and reports we see coming out from Syria, makes it very difficult for state actors like the U.S. to know who to support and to know what level of support to give to rebels. There isn't really one set of rebels. There isn't really one set of people trying to unseat Bashar al-Assad. Instead, the crux of the conflict is a religious war between the Shiites and Alawites on one side and the Sunnis. And both sides are led by the most radical of groups, Shiite Hezbollah on one side and Sunni al-Qaeda on the other. And neither of those are really natural allies for the U.S. And so the U.S. is in a position whereby even when red lines are crossed, red lines that they stated themselves for the best of reasons, with the best of intentions, they really don't know who to support in those situations. And giving weapons or sending troops to work alongside either of those players who are making up the rebel forces, it's a very complicated thing for the U.S. to do, which could result in even worse disaster all round.
How closely is Iran watching what the United States international community does and this red lines?
Well, of course, Iran will be watching the whole situation very closely. As I said just before, plenty of red lines have been set in relation to Iran's nuclear ambitions, which the West, especially the U.S. and Israel, deem to be geared towards building nuclear weapons capability. And, of course, the IAEA itself and most of the international community believes that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. So Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, of course, in that famous speech he gave at the UN, set a very clear red line, even drawing a red line in a diagram of a bomb to illustrate to the world where Israel placed its red line in relation to the Iranian nuclear development. Obama has also said that he stands side by side with Israel in believing and in saying that Iran will not be allowed to develop nuclear weaponry. So those two players are very close together and absolutely say that Iran will not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. But of course, as I said, Iran will be looking on at Syria, looking at Syria's alleged use of chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction of that type, and wondering if they themselves could get away with far more than has been expressed in the issuing of red lines regarding their particular weaponry ambition.
As things escalate in Syria and as the conflict escalates, does this provide some sort of reprieve to a degree, a welcome reprieve, I would say, that to the point that Iran, would be fomenting it, for Iran, in the sense that the attention of the United States international community, Israel and others are more focused on Syria than on Iran?
Iran's intention throughout the debate and discussion of its nuclear developments has absolutely been to stall for time. It's done very well at that as well, whether it's been in relation to negotiation and talks or whether it's been in its reaction to the sanctions placed upon it. What it seems to be expert at, while all of the world is acting in those ways, is stalling for more time while the centrifuges carry on spinning ever and ever faster. And those centrifuges are what is making the fissile material that they will be able to use for nuclear weaponry. Now, Iran is inching closer and closer on that matrix towards having nuclear weapons capability, but more importantly, towards the point at which they could very quickly reach nuclear weapons capability. And that's where they must be stopped first. So it's vital, of course, as you point out, that developments in Syria, whilst very important and very possibly explosive, should not distract the West, America, the US, the EU, the IAEA, from that development.
Just a fascinating situation. Obviously some very tough decisions that need to be made, decisions which will have consequences, whether if President Obama decides on inaction or obviously in action. So we're going to be watching this very closely. That was from London, Middle East expert Jonathan Sacerdoti. Thank you so much for joining us. This is from Washington al Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Clark Carone. We'll be right back.